Hello. So I'm Gaurav. I've been working with them in Technique for the past year and a half. That's when I started working on the ERP Next platform. Before that, I've been working on the VB6 and Access Stack, followed by VB.NET and MS SQL. And Frappe has been a breath of fresh air. So very few frameworks. Many frameworks claim that as a developer, you can directly focus on the business aspects, or rather the business intelligence of any business, and you can use things out of the box. But Frappe really delivers on that. So that's pretty amazing. So I'll be talking briefly about our journey in the past year and a half and what we have developed so far. So we started off with ERP Next customization, right? So out of the box, we had things like custom fields and script reports and all of that. So eventually, we had a use case where we had a third-party app, which had to use ERP Next as a backend. So the way to, that we could have used Frappe sessions, which is available out of the box. You have the API where you use, you supply the username and password, and you have a session where you can read ERP Next data and push, data back to it. But then we thought to ourselves that this is not how Google does it. Google uses OAuth tokens, so we decided to implement OAuth. So we did this for one of our, so the app was basically an AngularJS app with CouchDB in the backend, and it wanted to read projects from ERP Next and wanted to push back data as well. So then we made ERP, we had an implementation of OAuth2. We used OAuth lib, and we were able to integrate that into ERP Next, and that took care of the on the ERP Next side. But then what about on the app side itself? So there was no token management system to speak of on that application. So eventually, using ERP Next, since we did this, sorry, this is a little apprehensive, standing here. I beg your pardon. So yeah, deep breaths. Yeah, thanks. So yeah, so we started with that app. We were able to implement that, but eventually we thought that we can explore Android apps as well, and we had a use case for that where we couldn't, you have an Android app communicate with ERP Next, pull and push data. So for that we had to develop something more generic. We had the ERP Next side handled, where we have the OAuth provider, so you can register an Android app as an OAuth client, but we didn't have anything on the Android side. We needed a generic token management system. So that's when we implemented the OAuth2 Authenticator, which is an Android library, a standard library for token management. And then eventually we had this idea, which was slightly, I would say, blasphemous in the way things are going. Why blasphemous? Because we're talking about ERP Next as a monolith, but then we are considering microservices. So how does this work? So we thought, since we have a generic library, we have the setup on ERP Next to have these OAuth apps, why not have Frappe apps as microservices? So many businesses do need custom features, and it might make sense to implement them as separate Frappe apps and have them communicate with ERP Next over OAuth. So yeah, so this was a problem. Well, typically if you implement any kind of microservices architecture, taking care of identity, like a user ID, you might have different user IDs for different microservices. You don't get to see that anymore. This is kind of an old problem. If you use Google, you use things like Google Keep, Google Gmail, and everything. You can sign on with a single ID, your Gmail ID basically for every microservice. So we are trying to implement something similar, where you sign on using your ERP Next ID with every microservice. So this is what we have, and this has some entangled benefits. So let's say if you have self-hosted your ERP Next instance, you can do a lot of customization, and this probably will not work very well in that case. But if you are in Frappe Cloud user, then there are limits on how you can implement your customizations and how much you can customize. Of course, you have reports and custom fields are not a problem, but you have some, let's say, a use case where you have, let's say, you have a high-value sales order in ERP Next, and you want somebody to receive an alert to that effect. So you can't an email alert, yes, definitely, it's available out of the box. But let's say you want to send an SMS. So that kind of customization is not possible on the ERP Next Cloud at the moment. So you could have that customization in an isolated Frappe app, right? And you could use that, so whenever you create a sales order, you have this hook up to the Frappe app, and the Frappe app sends the SMS. So you could have that. So the ERP Next side is handled, like I said before, it's an OAuth2 provider. You register your app as an OAuth client in ERP Next. And as long as you have a token management system in any of these platforms, like a Django app, or an Electron app, or an Android, you have something called Scribe Java. So Scribe Java is another token management system. So I'll explain also what token management really means, how it works in the subsequent slide. So again, So you have that. As long as you have that, you can use that app to communicate with ERP Next every time. So the pros are obvious. You have fault tolerance. So let's say your customization, whatever you might have done on this app, is not the core part of what you do. So if that app fails for whatever reason, you can still use the ERP Next instance. You can still keep on making stock entries or make sales invoices or whatever. So it doesn't fail. So that is a great communication. And you have specialized platforms. So often it might happen that your customization does something very specific that is not, that requires you to send data to ERP Next. That still stays separate from ERP Next. Upgradability is another pro. So every time, ERP Next keeps on pushing a lot of upgrades every time. It's pretty, it keeps it current. So you don't have to think twice about upgrading your ERP Next instance. It gets upgraded automatically. So, and functionality doesn't break. It might happen that in your customization, you might have some bit of code that does not sit well, with Frappe, and it breaks. One common example, we ourselves had one bit of customization where the contact and customer fields, in the forms, they were linked together. So ERP Next eventually Frappe team decided to change the way this was implemented. They introduced the dynamic link, and that broke our customization. So we had to really, scramble to, work around that. So if you keep this separate, then, ERP Next can be used, a pristine instance can be kept separate, and the customizations don't break. So you have the latest code, and you can upgrade your other platform separately, as per your schedule. So that works. So yeah, so this is what I explained before. So in ERP, so like I said, you have an ERP Next cloud. You register your application as an OAuth client on the ERP Next cloud. You get a token, and you use that token to make REST API calls to ERP Next. So you want a resource request happens that way. So what a token really is, so the token sent by ERP Next is a JSON object basically. So it has three major components anyway. You have an access token, you have a refresh token, and you have an ID token. So ID token tells you which user has sent this token, and access and refresh token are used to make these resource calls. They're passed in the header of REST API calls for resources. So again, yeah, so as I mentioned before, we had the OAuth2 Authenticator, which is a token manager for Android, which we have implemented, so we could do that. Yeah, so this will briefly tell you what OAuth2 Authenticator does. So let's assume that your Android app already has a JSON object. Are you able to see this? Okay, at least somewhat. Okay, right. Okay, so we have a token. Let's assume we have a token already on your Android app. So what the token manager really does, it just makes a call to any endpoint. So it can be like if anybody has gone through the developer documentation for ERP Next, you have the ping API call. So you send a ping and you get a pong response back. So that's an authenticated API call. You need your credentials for that API call. So you use this token to make that a similar API call, and you get a pong back. So which means that the token is valid, right? So you can, if the response is valid, then you can use the same token to access the resource, like pull a list of tasks or pull a list of products or items or whatever, any resource from ERP Next. And the flow ends there. So now let's say if it is not valid, if it returns as a token, so you need to refresh that token. So like I mentioned, the token contains an access token and a refresh token. So you use the refresh, so the refresh token is then sent back, to get a new fresh access token with its own refresh token. And if that is valid, then you can access it. If it's still not valid, it means that the token has been revoked. So then you get, then the user is prompted with a login and a password screen. So that's when you can log in and get another fresh token. So that's how it works. So you need something like a token manager. So as long as, let me just go to the previous slide. Yeah, so as long as you have a token manager for any of these platforms, which are again commonly available in the open source domain, you have libraries which you can implement. So you are good to go. You can use ERP Next as a backend with any of these apps. Yeah, so considering Frappe app as a microservice, Webhooks is something that we also implemented in the meantime. So how does this work? So customization, again, like I said, so let's say you have a high value sales order and you want to send an SMS, or if you want to, let's say, synchronize a list of items. So let's say you have an Android app which has a list of items, correct? And you want, so the items are getting made all the time in the central ERP Next repository. And you want things to, to show up on your local Android app as well. So to keep that in sync, what you would do is you would put a hook on the on create, or or on any of those hook onto those events basically. But then you won't have any way of pushing that data because no customization on the Frappe cloud especially. So that's when we have webhooks. So what you can do is basically you see a screen where there's a grid. So So let's say you have a new item doc type. You select the event on which you want to hook, and you specify the URL. So where you want that hook to go. So every time a new event is added, a record gets pushed to your Android app as well. So it gets replicated that way, but just the ID and a server ID, so they can be kept in sync. So this is what we have also put. Right. So then finally the way ahead. So yesterday we had quite an intense discussion on contributions and pull requests and all that. So that is also something we have sort of altered up our philosophy to that as well. So generalize as far as possible, right? So the benefits. Okay, I see that this has been edited a little bit. Okay, so yeah, so I'd put in a point, right? So it's like think like Frappe. So that point isn't there anyway. So think like Frappe, as in let's say, so as a programmer, so first somebody asked me, okay, this is a high value sales order. I want to be able to send an email to someone. So how do I do that? The first thing that comes to mind that, okay, frappe.sendmail. And you use pdf.py, you import a function from there, you construct the PDF, attach it, and then send it using frappe.sendmail. But take a step back. Think about what you already have. There is a doc type called email alert in ERP Next. Use that. So think in that way. Think broader. Know what tools you have at your disposal before jumping into code directly, because you might find out that you are trying to reinvent the wheel, and that may not be necessary. So that's another thing. The benefits. So let's say if you generalize things and if you in such a way that you can pull request them. So the benefits are contributions. You end up making actual code contributions that bolster ERP Next functionality. And community discussion. Again, you think you might have the best feature which many people need, but that may not be the reality. I mean, of course, you might be very close, but there might be some features that are missing, or something that can be added, or your existing feature can be improved, perhaps. And the community will be the best, the best people there to tell you what is wrong. The hurdles are customer demand. So the customer demands something quite specific. I mean, they want a specific implementation, even on the technical side sometimes. So that is a bit of a hurdle. So that is something open to discussion. Perhaps we can come to a consensus on how to deal with that. Similarly, time to merge versus delivery deadline. So you have a pull request in mind. You put the pull request, but then it gets stuck in community discussion. So it takes time to merge, and that may not sit well. You have things to deliver. So that's another thing that I believe can be resolved through discussion. So thank you. That's what we have done so far. I think if there are any questions, yeah. Thank you.